That's great, Clayton, and I think it's an extremely important start off. We're talking about the original people of this country and the leadership that is now rising from them. And I want to acknowledge, just before we move on, just want to acknowledge a couple of people here that are with us this evening. Vanessa Gray from Sarnia, who is an Indigenous peoples organizer. Would you stand up, please, Vanessa? This is Vanessa Gray from Sarnia, next door. And Heather Milton Lightning, who is the co-director with Clayton of the Indigenous Tar Sands campaign. Would you stand up, please? Thank you. And they will be with us throughout this weekend. Now we're going to move on to another example and story of new organizing and new campaigning and new ways of doing things. How many people remember stepping back a year and a half from now, and remember the Quebec students movement? You remember that? Remember the incredible organizing that took place community by community. We'll hear more about this, but community by community, and also within the city of Montreal. Do you remember seeing the people with their pots and pans out? That's right. Well, we're fortunate to have with us this evening Jeremie Bedard Wein, who is the former spokesperson for Essex, and the Quebec, which was a major part of the component of the Quebec students movement. And Jeremie was also with us in the Port Elgin event that occurred just almost a year, or a little over a year ago. So will you please welcome Jeremie Bedard Wein.
Thank you. My thing might be a little longer since I don't have the rapturous flow of our friend Clayton. And you'll also see images of the big protests that we saw happening last year while I speak. I hope you'll enjoy the video. Maybe it'll bring back memories for some of you. Well, first I'd like to thank the organizers of the event, particularly Ken Loenza, of course, for inviting me here in Windsor. It's Union Country, and I'm glad to be here. I've been invited here to talk about this movement, the Maple Spring, this historic social movement that took place last year in Quebec. Under the banner of a coalition of student associations called CLASS, we fought a tuition increase of 75%, $1,600 in 5 years. For over 6 months, we erected picket lines in front of our colleges and universities. And we finally won. I tremendously enjoy describing in detail, the historic demonstrations and the civil disobedience, the fall of the government, blah, 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 the whole mythology. But I don't find it that important. It wasn't at all difficult to pull off once we got the machinery started. The bulk of the work that made the Maple Spring possible was achieved prior to the first general strike phase. It was achieved 2 years before the big demonstrations started. What became the Maple Spring was first conceived by a few dozen people in dirty union locals. 17-year-olds, 19-year-olds, 21-year-olds, far away from the spotlight, spending a little too much time away from school benches, choosing instead to agitate and organize. None were paid to do it. Most lived in precarious conditions. The struggle against tuition increases was for them a material struggle. It was about their own future in universities being compromised. Back then, our movement was far away from media. This general strike seemed like a far-fetched idea. Far-fetched because we were up against not only the well-oiled machinery of the Quebec Liberal Party, but also their ideology. Far-fetched because we had little money, we had no fancy communication strategy, we did not pander to power. It was far-fetched because we had been told time and time again that our generation was egotistic, apathic, that we would not rise to defend our rights. And this is not an unusual starting point. Most great political tides come out of nowhere. And the first wave of strike votes that swept Quebec in the winter of 2012 left journalists saying, "Oh, it will be short-lived." It would end the next week. Then it lasted another week, and another week, and another week. And it grew every time our government made offers to the students. Now, the journalists and political experts were scratching their head. They did not know what to make of it. They were waving their little pens. This is like a typical pastime of Radio Canada anchors. And they were wondering how we had done it. And again, when the tide rose to include hundreds of thousands on the 22nd of March 2012, and again when 250,000 Canadians, Quebecers, but also Canadians from all parts of the country, marched illegally on the 22nd of May against the repressive Bill 78. I still can't believe it. I myself wave a little bit sometimes, and I still wonder how he did it. Was it the product of a perfect storm? Was it because, and I hear this quite often, Quebecers are kind of born protesters. They have like this inner culture of resistance that other people don't have. The answer is much more complex, of course. Let's start with what we were up against, this all-powerful right, represented here by 9 years of liberal Charest government. The right has many advantages. It's in government, that's quite obvious, when it's elected. The unelected right here actually has more power, and by that I mean the lobbyists, I mean the private sector, I mean the university principals and the international institutions who are arguing for privatization of the universities. The right is also extremely well funded. My organization had a budget in the low six figures. We had no strike fund because there was no strike pay to issue. Something of this scale demands tremendous investment in mobilization. And then there were the costs of fighting against the legal framework of repression invoked by our government. And without the help, and I want to emphasize this tonight, without the help of Canadian labor, especially Ontarian locals, we would not have made it through. By contrast, I don't even know what Justin Trudeau's pretty hair pulls through every month. Probably quite a lot of money. Finally, the right has close ties to media conglomerates. Now, Rob Ford getting his own TV show is a good example. But for us, it was mostly about terrible coverage of the student strike. From the very beginning, the media ate up the government rhetoric and painted us as, entitled whiners, babies. I myself was caricatured as a baby with a nice little diaper. And we were really whiners. We were profiting off the state. And it didn't matter that 7,000 students would not be able to go to university. This was completely negated by media coverage. This right-wing infrastructure is a powerful propaganda tool. By elevating the individual above all else, it breaks what ties us together. Even political action becomes a profoundly individual gesture. It's reduced to one act. It's reduced to voting every 4 years. Is this what democracy really is about? I don't think so. And I don't want to learn from that right. These attributes are what ties this profoundly unjust worldview together. Big money and advertising as politics is what they use to keep Canadians from exercising their democratic rights. We cannot win by emulating what they have perfected through 30 years of war against the working class. How did we win then? We won by learning from others. First, we learned from the movements against austerity in Europe, in the United States. We learned from student movements in Chile, in England, who had struggled against the same currents of privatization. But most importantly, we went through our own history. When a tuition increase was announced, we looked through our archives. 1969, 1974, 1984, 1996, 2005. General student strikes protected Quebec universities forever, many times throughout history. This is how they are still accessible. And if we look at the Canadian labor history, we will find as many instances of great victories of the working class, and we should not be ashamed to bring those tactics up. The right wing was not going to expect a return to the old tactics of union militancy, and this is what they got in Quebec. They expected us to play by their rules. We threw those rules out. Now, the government's framing of the tuition issue was extremely coherent. It could already rely on the well-established foundation of neoliberal economics, the core belief that people need to pay for the services they use. That public services have to be funded by individuals rather than by the collectivity, by the state. Now, this subtle withdrawal of state financing from public services had been going on for a long time, since our PQ government first took as a godly mission to reach a balanced budget, zero deficit. Thus, we faced two challenges. First, we needed to defeat the economics of the tuition increase. Of course, we needed to prove that we could get by without the tuition increase financially. But in parallel, we also needed to achieve much more. We needed to drastically alter people's perception of the role of university, the role of our public services. It's kind of a cultural dissent. We demanded immediate reforms, yes, but we tied them with a radical project for society and framed this debate as a debate of values, as a debate which would set the directions we would take in the future. And our values, I'm sure you share: feminism, social justice, solidarity amongst student movements, one that saw many Quebecers protest along with I Don't Know More in Montreal and other parts of the country. Entirely free education, free from tuition fees, free from market influence. This is something that we need to argue for. We should not be compromising and arguing about numbers. We should be talking about principles. And this principle that we always fought for was free education. These are the ideas. In practice, if you want to defend collective services, you have to do it collectively. Prior to the general strike, we took action time and time again. First, small actions, like writing letters and petitions. Then bigger actions, such as one-day strikes, accompanied by demonstrations. This we call the escalation of tactics. It's a slow rising pressure. It sends a very strong message to the government, but most importantly, it sends a strong message to the activists themselves. They experience the fact that they are ignored. They experience the fact that we need heftier tactics to defeat these policies. And for us, that meant the general strike. Real enforced picket lines in front of dozens of campuses across the province for as long as it was necessary. That meant direct action. That meant blocking banks, blocking government buildings. That meant facing police violence on a daily basis. Over 3,000 people were arrested during the strike. To make that possible, we had to talk to every single student in the province. That's how you mobilize people. You hand them a sheet of paper and you talk to them. And you talk to them again and again, and then you invite them to a demonstration, and a second one, and then a general assembly, and then they are ready. Then they can figure out what the next step is. Our worldview, as you can see, our worldview and our tactics consisted of a radical break from the playing field of the right. However, we did take something out of their playbook, and that's left unity. There are other provincial student associations in Quebec, one that do not always share our perspective. And it took many concessions, it took a lot of goodwill to come together against the tuition increase, however tenuous the collaboration. We formed structural links with labor unions, national and local. We formed links with community groups. We formed coalitions, waging a struggle against not only tuition fees, but all other policies of the cultural revolution of the Liberal government. We worked closely with the left-wing think tank, IRIS, to fuel our action with ideas. Class wasn't one monolithic bloc either. As one friend often puts it, it was a historic coalition between anarchists, socialists, and social democrats. The anarchists did direct action, boom, 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 boom. The socialists did political planning and, read marks in dark rooms. And the social democrats, they played around with their cell phones and did social media. We cannot afford to be divided, yes, yet we cannot afford to completely whitewash our differences by convincing ourselves action should always precede political debate. And one debate that we didn't have, Ken Loenza did ask that I talk about shortcomings. One debate that we didn't have was the electoral question. In early August 2012, our movement was still going strong. We had over 160,000 students on strike. We thought it would go on pretty much forever. And seeing that it wasn't a deadlock, our government called early elections. This is something we had not planned for. We defeated the government, fine, but what now? We were left stranded, paralyzed. We had taken strong stances against any collaboration with political parties, but we also knew that if we advocated voting in principle, we would favor the current party in power, the PQ, which has now raised tuition fees again. At the same time, I fully understand why we were left scrambling for a solution. A few days ago, I was lucky enough to be in Prague, and I was sharing a round of delicious Pilsner with a few friends, all of whom are very politically involved. They are not anarchists. They're not ideally opposed to parliamentary politics. But when I asked if they had vote in last month's election, everyone said no. No, no, no. I was surprised. I thought maybe they had been in a drunken stupor. I hear this is a regular occurrence in Ontario. Maybe you can relate. But I don't think so. I think in the Czech Republic, the political spectrum is slowly being squeezed to the center with the same austerity policies straight out of European Union institutions being imposed to all countries by both left and right-wing parties. Many of our own friends in Quebec did the same thing during the last federal election. You know, I myself would like to vote for a party that actually advocates for raising taxes on the rich. We don't have that in Canada. Our movements may never solely rely on electoral politics. And in 2015, we will have to marry our will to defeat Stephen Harper with our will to enact lasting, profound change by attacking ideas, not individuals or political parties. The questions of how we will make that happen, to me, is closely tied to how we conceive ourselves to be. The 17, 18, 20-year-olds who first dreamt of the Maple Spring are still around, although few of them actually took part in that movement. They are still unpaid, they still live in precarity, but they still organize out of rage and despair and out of hope for a better future. In this very moment, as I speak, in Toronto, in Montreal, in Barrier Lake, in Quebec, or in a Catholic high school in Windsor, they are organizing against austerity politics or against the destruction of our environment. They are fighting the racism and sexism deeply embedded in Canadian society. They are scheming for an alternative. They are the alternative. And these people are the grassroots. Now in Quebec, we call it direct democracy. It happens in vast, leaderless general assemblies. And it's about empowering people who are not in this room. It's about seeing ourselves as facilitators rather than leaders, spokespersons rather than presidents. But there is a catch. It means giving real day-to-day ownership of our movements to a mass of people who will give it shape, direction, collectively. That experience should be an integral part of this mobilization. It is a link that we too often forget. And it starts in rooms such as this one. If this was a college auditorium 3 years ago during a student assembly, we would have seen maybe half of the people present in the room. At the height of the strike, we would have needed 5 of these auditoriums filled to the brim with students who want to defeat a tuition hike, march in the streets, and take part in a radical political movement. And that meeting would have lasted 3 times longer. We have a struggle to wage, but our members, colleagues, friends, comrades are not soldiers in an army. The Maple Spring was made up of men or women who felt they were part of something bigger than themselves, bigger than any single person, bigger than the leaders, bigger than the stakeholders and key strategists. That's why they believed they could block the hike collectively, and that's how they blocked the hike. That's how we disrupted Canadian politics and the political consensus around privatization. That's how we brought an entire government down, and if necessary, we will do it again collectively. It will take courage to break from some of our habits and tremendous work to build this collective power. But once we do, once we take that great bargain, that leap of faith, this tidal wave will finally rise. First, we'll find victories locally, right here in our communities, and then we'll be able to say that we have defeated their omnibus bills, their environmental deregulation, their historic attacks against the labor movement, their university and factory closures. We will defeat big money, we will defeat their somber ideological vision for Canada, and finding our own vision starts right here tonight. And I wish you good luck in forming the Citizens' Assembly. I wish you good luck in waging that struggle here in Windsor. I hope we will be able to bring it to the national level, to Canada, to Quebec, to First Nation communities. And I thank you for your time.